Born July 26, 1928, New York City. My father is a doctor. I had few intellectual interests. As a child, I was a school misfit, and I don't think I read a book for pleasure until after I graduated high school. I had one thing I think that perhaps helped me get over being a misfit, a school misfit, and that is that I became interested in photography. I mean, at this point, I was the whole crew: cameraman, assistant cameraman, director, everything. You have to have patience because if you don't, your own frustrations prove to be too much of a distraction. It is a slow, it's like those games where you jiggle all the balls into place. Sometimes there's more balls you're jiggling than others, but it's largely that. And if you allow yourself to become irritated, then it's just another distraction.
Your first experience with a Kubrick film will be a somewhat perplexing one. The distinguished approach to filmmaking can make it difficult to comprehend, let alone analyse what you've just seen. However, if you do find yourself delving into this artist's oeuvre, then you'll discover a filmography comprised not of accessibility, but experimentation, headed by a director whose craft becomes established through a desire to reshape cinematic form itself, defined by his constant need for a continual change in technique, where everything becomes centred around reinvention.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here, this is the war room!
It's a strenuous task to look at the works of Stanley Kubrick without coming across as panegyric, but I have to make that preface when discussing possibly the most celebrated visual artist of the 20th century.
You know, everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man, and I still feel that underrates him.
So what is it about Kubrick films that escalate them to the highest tier of cinema? Well, you'll find that every project is received as an artistic revolution, not just in the context of his other work, but in the domain of film itself. His filmmaking techniques are striking, but these salient approaches define the man as a director of extremes, both in content and execution. His films don't deal with intimate dramas, they examine the grandiose characteristics of life, exploring the deteriorating effects of war, or the secrets kept by society so they may partake in their darkest fantasies. High concept subject matter and filmmaking techniques delivered with such ferocity that it redefined the cinematic experience, redefined to such a degree that logic almost dissipates and pure experientiality takes over. Few other filmmakers match Kubrick's attention to detail in his work, and his process to think of works as ways to reshape lives could be seen as the origin of this. Because to think of art as having responsibilities other than just to be art elevates its importance in the mind of its creator. When it must convey a message, it must have a purpose. This created a style of directing for Kubrick wherein every single element on screen was motivated. From character movement to costume design, everything had a meaning. There's an immeasurable degree of depth in Kubrick's collection of work due to his refined, conscientious filmmaking style. Because when every detail becomes a necessary intellectual component of a narrative, it becomes simpler to understand his prestige in the medium.
When I first saw 2001, I didn't like it. 3 or 4 months later, I was with some woman in California, and I went to see it again, and I liked it a lot more. A couple of years later, I saw it again, and I thought, gee, this is really a sensational movie. And it was one of the few times in my life that I realized that the artist was much ahead of me.
In order to research this project, I decided to visit the Stanley Kubrick archives in London. My time there was spent rummaging through boxes upon boxes of research material, script amendments, storyboards. It's a haven of everything from his films that you could possibly imagine. What I discovered was the procedure of how Kubrick would make a film, learning that every stage required a meticulous approach in the moulding of them. Few rivaled his research, and his work ethic bordered on the obsessed. This experience was how I imagine it is to see a great painter's brushes, it was a way to gain a brief glimpse into the mind of a master at work. Across all phases of Kubrick's projects, his diligent attention to detail can be found. Here was a man who, even though he was financed by the studios, he gained a good enough reputation that meant he could maintain full creative control, and he took this advantage into every area of every project.
I remember one of the visits that I had with Stanley was at his home when he was working on Napoleon, and he had a grid, a very detailed grid, and this covered the wall. He was counting the figures in each of these little squares that made up the grid.
Pre-production may have meant location scouting an entire city just to find the perfect doorway. During filming, it wasn't unknown for one scene to have over 50 takes, and once the film was finished, the editing may have been the most demanding task. Kubrick would have countless reaction shots, and instead of settling simply with one that worked, he would go through every single take. The intense control even continued to Kubrick's involvement with distribution, checking all the prints sent to cinemas, and even visiting a few theatres himself. Many may look upon this work ethic and find it extensive, but this need to complete his vision and the determination he pursued it with is what gave Kubrick films such depth. But what exactly are people referring to when they refer to depth in a Kubrick film?
Many artists, when they put a canvas up, which is blank, they start with very detailed pencil strokes, very small, delicate pencil strokes. Stanley started conceptually at all of his movies, from my point of view, with large, primary colored brush strokes. And he would just like beat out these concepts.
What was the culmination of this method? Well, it's one thing to have control, but to fuse this with Kubrick's tendency for dynamic visual storytelling granted every visual aspect of the frame an almost sacred quality. If there's one thing Kubrick should be remembered for, it's that he changed the way visual stories were told. By manipulating the mise-en-scène in a way that hadn't been done before, he was able to communicate through his own unique methods. Backgrounds and supporting areas of the main narrative contain some of the most vital information through its imagery. A majority of the film's thematic presence thus became hidden in plain sight. This resulted in films with a multitude of narrative layers. Kubrick's narrative focus existed perpetually in a grey area. He would never sacrifice the main subject's story. However, his ostensible subject matter concealed the true messages within his films. With Kubrick, a camera movement was more than just a camera movement, and an action was more than just an action. This method of articulating ideas was one wherein everything seemed to contain a double meaning. One that serviced the narrative, and another to deliver a symbolic connotation.
He reaches over to shake Jack Nicholson's hand. And so step through that scene, frame by frame, and the minute that he and Jack Nicholson touch hands, and right after the lines, which is "nice to see you," you can see a paper tray on the desk turns into a very large straight-on hard-on coming out of Barry Nelson.
For instance, hints to character intentions were disguised in their actions. Victor's 2 taps on the red table
that was just
matches the 2 taps of Red Cloak's staff on the red floor. And Kubrick carefully choreographed this sequence down to each step. Similarly in Clockwork, Alex's enjoyment of violence is demonstrated through his 2 kicks on the writer,
From the place,
matched with the 2 taps in the bathtub.
everyone from the place.
And these are the less extreme examples. Because of Kubrick's fascination with the visuals, this transcended to their usage in his films to be implemented in their most abstract form, pure symbolism. Kubrick's manner of filmmaking was to deliver all of the information to the audience, just not tell them that that information is there. Because he found that the least effective way to tackle ambitious themes was to do so directly, so instead subtle seeds had to be planted into the audience's consciousness. Kubrick raises the importance of his symbolic narratives to equal that of his main subject's narrative, and in doing so, his films blur the line of the conscious and the unconscious. Kubrickian storytelling can be summed up by saying that it's the audience's job to discover meaning for themselves, and it's accomplished by complementing those two opposing forces.
I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir.
The what?
The duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir.
The most important part of watching a Kubrick film is how the experience feels, not the analysis of its reasoning. His films are puzzles that the viewer must assemble, but quoting Lovecraft, in All Things Mysterious, never explain. Kubrick avoided offering answers in his work. Each film is merely a hypothesis. Never abandoning the key subjects of his films, they always remained his main focus. However, one of their duties was to be a vessel for the filmmaker to explore greater themes. His films are methods of expressing an idea without offering explanation to it. Because when an audience must create meaning for themselves, it tests them to think on a higher plane of consciousness. Remember, Kubrick wanted to reshape lives. We see this even in his subject matter. Writer Michel Simon said that Eyes Wide Shut and The Shining are opposite in intention. One is about the dangers of being pent up in family life, whereas the other is about the dangers of straying too far from the family. These could be viewed as contradictory ideals, but Kubrick doesn't say that either is right. The themes don't offer a conclusion. The filmmaker is holding a mirror to us and asking that we figure it out. Many of Kubrick's films can be viewed as allegories. His first film, Fear and Desire, is a very obvious example. The title itself is the themes of the film. But over the course of his career, Kubrick learned that the key to his idea of cinematic experience is ambiguity. For instance, take how transitions were used in his early work.
3 days later, at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, Johnny Clay began the final preparations.
And here they are later, when pure experience was the priority. Kubrick understood that exposition isn't always necessary. First work on the content of the scene, and then figure out how that message can be translated cinematically. For Kubrick, this could be injected in the subtlest of ways because of his fastidious control. Character relationships surreptitiously conveyed through the art department, and positioning displaying paradigm shifts, or perhaps that things have remained the same. There's a circularity of the film's details throughout Kubrick's work. Techniques would re-emerge later in the piece, so that scenes are to be compared and contrasted with one another. This is how Kubrick dealt with his grand themes, by envisioning his films as self-contained ideas that grow and morph throughout their expression, as ideas do in real life. Visuals were Kubrick's biggest ally. He utilised the notion that all elements within an image had the capacity to convey something that the audience must figure out. They're jigsaws, where a piece is not so much missing as it is purposefully concealed. This is how cinema is done.
Good night, sir!
Hit it, sweetheart.
Sir, aye, aye, sir!
But an artist is nothing without form, and filmmaking techniques are the trademarks of any director. So what was Kubrick known for? I referred to Kubrick earlier as a director of extremes, and I use this definition because of the frequency as well as the intensity of his techniques. Kubrick's films often feel very distant, and that's because they're supposed to be. You can sense a certain barrier between the viewer and the film's universe, a barrier that's strengthened by the film's cinematic methods to disengage the viewer from personally identifying with the world. Techniques that stand out are essential, because Kubrick was creating a unique perspective. This wasn't our world. This world is exclusive of the movie.
One of the things he said to me that I've always remembered was, in movies you don't try and photograph the reality. You try and photograph the photograph of the reality.
First, we need to examine the artistic decisions that Kubrick made, and we can categorise the purpose of many as methods to exaggerate and distract. The camera carried a frenzied need to amplify whatever was on screen. Wide angles become extreme wide angles. Low angles become extreme low angles. The reason behind this penchant for the excessive was because Kubrick emphasises a reality that presents a warped representation of humanity, and the universe of the film replicates this. This is a metaphoric reality, a cinematic reality. His methods always reminded us of this fact, therefore it was crucial that they be distinctive. Take a look at zooms for example. They're an almost absent tool in cinema nowadays just because of how distracting they are. Yet Kubrick used them religiously. There are certain rules that filmmakers typically follow so that they can retain audience immersion. But Kubrick sought to continually break these rules. He utilised the techniques that were unique to cinema, the camera movement, the editing, and heightened them so that he could distinguish his worlds as separate from our own. In turn, they acknowledge and embrace their symbolic nature. This can be seen even further with the inhabitants of these worlds. Because Kubrick's focus revolved heavily around humanity, the acting was watched with heavy scrutiny. Kubrick typically let shots ride out with very little editing to not only build to a climax, but to focus on an actor's performance. Often during dialogue scenes, sometimes the only thing shown would be the reaction shots. Kubrick thought it more important to show how people deal with their situations rather than the situations themselves. Focusing on the reaction gets this message across very well, as you isolate the effect. Kubrick could even forego what the character was looking at just to focus on their face, removing what would typically be a close-up. Another example of reducing information delivered to the audience. But whenever possible, action and reaction would be in the same shot.
I'm coming through fine too, eh? Good, then... Well then, as you say, we're both coming through fine.
But displaying the exaggerated depiction of humanity becomes evident in the performance itself. Kubrick once said that it can be very difficult not to have a cynical view of human relationships, and his pessimistic view can't be ignored from his work, as it becomes very visible in his character's expressions and performance. We see the infamous Kubrick glare, where faces contort into the most sinister forms imaginable, and character interactions can feel stilted and cold. That's because these characters are products of the environments they populate. The denizens of each universe simply exist in the most discernible part of the moral spectrum, and their actions are intensified to match Kubrick's extreme view of the darkest parts of the human spirit, the area he was so interested in exploring. The methodology of Kubrick centered on developing a cinematic world whose self-awareness mimicked the extreme tone that his characters lived in. It all services creating an atmosphere that would make it believable that the situations we see could occur. The techniques of Kubrick weren't just there to be obnoxious and show off, they were complementary of this belief. Whether this meant the destabilization of the camera during the most thrilling moments, or the action on screen practically choreographed to the music that's played. It's important that the filmmaking of a movie matches its tone, and Kubrick did just that as well as create a much deeper significance. He assembled films of tonal excellence because every possibility was exhausted in order to find the correct way to relay these messages. The multiple narratives were complemented by Kubrick's filmmaking, because every decision was galvanized by his desire for artistic expression. Kubrick was once asked on how much he plans a scene. He responded, "As much as there are hours in the day and days in the week." This pretty much sums up how Kubrick thought of movies. He was a known perfectionist, but how can you argue with the results? Nothing was out of the realm of possibility for Kubrick. If something seemed impossible, he would simply work on propelling the technology of the medium forward so he could get it done. Because everything Kubrick did had a sufficient reason. Through his stylization of every filmic element, he was able to communicate through all facets, through an audience that he treated with respect. Because in order to test the audience, you must first test yourself. Stanley Kubrick didn't just make films. He defined the cinematic experience.